My name is Nigel Adams and I'm talking today from Oxfordshire. I work in the countryside. I do a whole range of what I call countryside management jobs. One of the main ones is advising on hedgerows in the countryside and also doing the old craft. Right, okay, so HedgeLink is a great source of information about hedgerows, and the National Hedge Laying Society is our organisation that organises everything to do with hedge laying. So my talk is really about the countryside, the rural hedgerows that we have in the UK. We have 457,000 kilometres of hedgerow in the UK, and I think it's the greatest density of hedgerows anywhere in Europe, really, along with Ireland. I think they define the English countryside hedgerows. Without them, I can't imagine what our landscape would look like. All is not well with them in some cases. The last survey of hedgerows showed that only 50% were in good condition, in favourable condition. And when you looked at arable farming areas, that is areas of farming where they grow crops, that figure drops to 12% of hedgerows. So we need to constantly be aware of hedgerows. They've gained huge enthusiasm in recent years, hedgerows. They're very, very important. We've recognised their importance. Just a little bit of writing here. So hedgerows, we know, facilitate movement throughout the landscape for a wide range of organisms. Everything from a small mammal to a butterfly or an insect don't like to cross over large fields, so they use the hedgerows to navigate around the fields. Bees, for example, when they find a food source, will come back and show the route following hedgerows to get to that food source. Bats hunt along them, that kind of thing. Their original reason was to provide a living fence to keep animals in or out of a field, and they also provide a great deal of shelter for farm stock, farm animals, especially last year in the great heat of last year. They were very, very important. They can stop soil erosion down the slope, both from wind and indeed water runoff, because the water percolates through the roots. They can reduce the amount of polluting fertilizers and pesticides that are spread by machinery. They can stop them, slow them down before they reach watercourses. They are a culturally important part of our landscape. They define our landscape, as I said. The great buzzword at the moment is that they store carbon, not huge amounts, but a significant amount of carbon in the farmed environment. And they often provide the only semi-natural habitat in a modern farmed environment. We have two main types of hedgerow in this country. One is the ancient species-rich hedges, which were often the results of clearing woodland, full of different species in the hedgerow, often on old banks. As an example of their biodiversity, a friend of mine in Devon in the southwest of England recently counted every single living organism he could find within 90 metres of his hedge in Devon. And everything had to be present in the hedge. He went past 1,000, he went past 2,000. It got a little bit difficult, so he's having to send micro flies to the British Museum, but he's on about 2,600 species of everything that is alive, from flowers to mosses to birds to insects. 2,600 species and 90 metres of this old type of hedge with very irregular field shapes. The other main type is the type we call the enclosure hedges. Between 1750 and 1860, what was previously open field system was divided up into straight lines, into a planned countryside. They mostly use one species, which was hawthorn, which is Crataegus monogyna, and these are the ones that are in a bit of trouble. We recognize their value in modern farming environment, and a hedge like this, we would say, is perfect. It's a little bit wild. It's not being trimmed too hard. It has a margin between the hedge and the field, and that is an absolutely wonderful example of a wildlife corridor that a hedgerow can provide. We trim our hedges. We trim them with a tractor machine, which we'll see in a minute. But we now realize that, of course, if you trim a hedge every single year really hard, then there is no potential for it to set the blossom. And blossoms are incredibly important as we come out of winter for the first emerging insects. They like to have a sequence of blossoms coming out at a different time to get their food from, and that is exactly what happens. But that does not happen if we trim our hedges very, very hard to the same height. Blossom needs 2-year-old wood to set on. And of course, once the blossom is set, then in the autumn, we have a vast array of different berries, which provide a fantastic food source for animals before the winter. So they store up with this to get the strength to get through the cold winters, as it were. Hedges have always been trimmed, even in the countryside, and very often, as we saw in a talk this morning, they've been trimmed with this long-handled slasher. In an upwards motion, they were trimmed, but you can imagine that that's not cutting them very harsh, very hard. So very slowly over time, the hedge will slowly increase in size, remain healthy and increase in size, and then will be too big even to trim with a long-handled slasher. And that's where hedge laying comes in, which we'll look at in a moment. The 1940s, we had lots of different machinery inventions to take away that annual task of cutting by hand or laying hedges. Every farmer had one or two hedge layers on the land, and hedge laying was winter work. But these machines kind of did away with that. And I personally think we forgot to, we can't remember how to read the hedge. Where is the hedge? What condition is it in? We just cut them every single year because they don't really matter. That's probably what we thought. And now we have the tractor flail machine, and nearly all the hedges in the countryside are now cut with this tractor flail. The tendency is to cut to the same height every single year, and it's really it really forces our hedgerows to be in bad condition. And this is a good example. This hedge has been cut at the same height for probably since the 1960s. Also, it has sheep eating underneath the hedge, but this hedge really has no future. It's very old. It's very unviable going into the future, and that's caused by over trimming. This is another example, something I would call a ghost hedge. Again, has been cut at exactly the same height since the 1960s, produces no berries, no blossom, because it's cut to the same height every year. And even at the base of these hedges, this is hawthorn, these will be old and rotten and very little future. And this, I think, is what is happening if you use your imagination. If we plant a hedge and put a steel cage around it, and every time a small branch comes out, we trim it, then for the first 25 or 30 years of its life, I'm sure the wire cage will be full and be lovely and green. But after a time, if we keep cutting at the same height, the stems become sort of twisted, looking for light, the greenness, the green small leaves go up to the top. And really, it's no habitat for animals or shelter to animals or anything. And I think this is what we're doing. We're imagining we can keep something, a living bush, at the same height forever, and it just doesn't work. And this, to me, is a sure sign of that happening. At the cut line, it's what I call a knuckle, like when you close your fist on your hand. It's like a hard knuckle with a stress reaction there happening. And that's a message from the hedge to us, I think, to please back off, please relax now, and let me slowly develop in my natural life cycle. Some machine cut hedges look absolutely fine. I like the word clipping, really. It is sympathetically trimmed. The person is allowing the hedge to slowly develop in time, keeping the hedge nice and thick, but never trying to stop it at one height. So that we've just looked at over trimming, which has caused a lot of our hedges here to be in poor condition. The other dynamic which affects change on our hedges is total neglect. So then obviously nature really wants to become a line of trees. If you leave your lawn alone, in 200 years' time, it will become a forest. It's the same with hedgerows. If we don't rejuvenate the hedge from the base by some method, then it's going to start falling down, collapsing. These things will die, or nature takes its course and it starts to turn into a line of trees. So I developed this 1 to 10 scale by which we can actually place a hedgerow at any given time in a number from 1 to 10, which we'll look at in a minute. And really, when a hedge reaches this stage of being a line of trees, there's nothing much we can do with it. It's a line of trees, very important for bats and for other animals, but it's never going to be the thick, dense hedge which small birds, for example, like to live in. And this just sums up, I think, not all, but some of my scale of 1 to 10. And number 1, when you look at a hedge in the winter, is an old, decrepit, been cut at the same height, going downhill. That's the worst kind of hedge. It's full of gaps. That would score as a number 1. Number 3 here has lots of stems in it, so it has potential to be allowed to develop onwards. But if we keep cutting hard, it will go down to number 1. Number 5, in the middle of the 1 to 10 scale, is a healthy hedge with lots of stems, lots of potential. But we know that if we left that alone, it will start to develop to a number 8 over time, getting a bit too big there to do any management on it, and eventually will be a number 10. So this is a useful scale. You can find it on the HedgeLink page. There are 1 to 10 scale to look at our countryside hedges to see what position in the life cycle they are. And this sums up what I see to be a life cycle. The top right-hand corner is a healthy hedge with lots of stems. But if we trim it to that height for many, many, many years, it goes down to the top left, becomes a very gappy, old, dying hedge. Bottom left, there's our healthy hedge, lots of stems, doing really well, providing lots of ecosystem services. And then if we neglect it, it will become this line of trees or start to fall down. This hedge would be somewhere in the middle. This would score a number 7. And if you look about 1 meter above the ground, you can see a sort of, I'm not sure you can see my arrow, but you can see a sort of shadow line. Well, the hedge was trimmed at that height for a long, long, long time. And then the landowner allowed it to come up. Now, one of the main reasons for hedges was to stop animals getting in or out of fields before wire was invented. And here you could see that an animal could push through those vertical stems. So this is a perfect hedge in which to lay hedges. Now, I show you this picture as something that might represent what early hedge laying throughout Europe might have been. This is actually in France. The first ever agricultural book printed in Great Britain was by Fitzherbert in 1523. And he spends a lot of time talking about hedge laying, describes it, but describes this older, kind of more crude, shall I say, type of hedge laying, making the vertical stems diagonal, therefore stopping animals going through. And you'll see this with this style, which I think is the Belgian plaque hedge style, that it's tied on with small pieces. The diagonals are tied to the living stems with small pieces of willow, which they still do now. Very, very complex knot tied with willow to hold everything together. This is a hedge from northern Germany, the cross hedge, the Kreishag. These often were with hornbeam, for example, where at a young age, each plant was taken across diagonally and some plants taken the other way, formed this cross hedge, which was lots of pictures of it all around Schleswig-Holstein and around churches, actually. And when you do it with hornbeam, they actually grow together, which I believe is called inoculation. They actually bond together and grow, forming a long-lasting hedge in itself. This is a very rare type of, I'll call it hedge laying. It doesn't actually involve cutting, but they bend them over. This is in an area in Germany called the Nieheim. This is the Nieheim hedge, kept alive by one man. There's just one man was left doing it until recently. And these are all bent over. They're not cut, they're sort of bent over at an early age, still again forming that barrier to keep animals in or out of fields. So hedge laying developed all over Europe. Not so common at all in mainland Europe, but in Britain, we've kept the craft, the skill going for many years. This is an early picture in the 1920s of someone doing some English hedge laying, digging the ditch, throwing the soil from the ditch up on the base of the hedge. And where the man is standing, of course, the animals would be in that field on that side now. And I suppose it can be said that in this country, we've perfected the art of hedge laying. We've made it a work of art, if you like. It is becoming very popular. There are government grants to carry this out, and people love to see it. The members of the public absolutely love to see this old craft still being done. So what is hedge laying? Well, hedge laying, as I said, before wire was invented, you needed some way to keep animals in or out of fields. And so each of the stems along a hedgerow was individually, one at a time, cut diagonally down, leaving not very much at the bottom of that axe, maybe 1/10 of the wood, just enough of the cambium layer to take the sap up and down, so that is living. The French word for this is plessage, or we call it pleaching sometimes. Very old word. It's an plex. It was the Latin word, and it was an Indo-European name, forgive me, which actually plex meant to make something complicated, to weave together. That's where we get the word complex from. They're actually talking about hedge laying. Plex means this weaving. So we cut nearly all the way through and then lean that over. It's still attached. Here again, you can see these pleachers, as we call them, from the word plesser. And that all that's above there is living. It's a living barrier, and we will get new growth from the base there, from those cut bases. That's very important. It's a form of rejuvenating the hedge as well as forming a barrier. And these days we don't need the barrier so much. We have wire fences, but hedge laying is seen as providing a fantastic habitat for birds and insects. These are the tools we use very commonly, the axe and something on the left there called a bill hook, of which there are many, many different types. The types of bill hook all around the country, developed very, very locally and often made locally by what we call blacksmiths. And here's a small map showing only some of the types of bill hook from around the country. There are literally hundreds and hundreds, and everybody has their favorite. So very quickly, the quick process of hedge laying. As I say, we take each individual stem going along a hedgerow. First of all, we clear the top. That's me looking up into the top to make sure the top of the stem is free, because I want to do that before I start cutting at the base. Make sure the top is free. I then start to cut through the stem diagonally on the opposite side that I want the stem to go. And you usually start cutting about 2 to 3 times the diameter. So if the diameter is, say, I don't know, 8 centimeters or so, then you start your cut 3 or 4 times that high, and you come down diagonally, cutting down diagonally so that it's flexible and you can then take it over. When the hedge plant comes down, there might be branches going in all directions, in which case I do another of these special cuts here, just thinning it down and then bending it into the hedgerow to make this solid barrier. We bring in these, what we call stakes. These are made from hazel, and we put those and we knock those into the ground along the center line of the hedgerow to make everything completely strong, so that animals can't push it over. The whole thing is alive and very, very strong. So quickly on some of the different styles, this big strong hedge here is called the Midland style, from the middle area of England. It's a hedge which was against cows, for example, and you can see it's laid back over to the backside, and all that thorn is on the backside, and in that field behind, that's where the cows would be next year in the field rotation system. That's called the Midland style. There are about 30 styles that could be described, and probably about 18 styles that are still used around the country. This is North Somerset style. The cutting on all these styles is exactly the same. This is Welsh styles. There's a lot of Welsh styles, and they actually put a lot of deadwood into the hedge. It's a typical hedge for a country where there's lots of sheep both sides. Same cutting effect there. This is rather unusual in that it has a top rail along the top. This is from Yorkshire. That's the Yorkshire style. Devon style is very different again, because in Devon in the southwest, they have these massive banks, really, really big, maybe sometimes 2-3 meters across. And they lay a flat hedge along the front of each side of the bank to stop the animals getting up and over. Again, the cutting method is the same. This is south of England, and this has the brash or the branches both sides. And you can see there, that's at a competition. We actually have competitions around the countryside. Here you can see, this is my son. He's putting on the what we call the binders, the top binders. These are woven along the top. These things are cut off. We buy them from somewhere else, and he's just binding along the top, which again makes the whole thing incredibly tight and strong. We're very lucky to have as the patron of our society King Charles, and believe it or not, hedge laying is a passion of his. It's a hobby of his. It's probably his main hobby, and certainly before he recently got promotion, he would be out hedge laying every Wednesday afternoon or Saturday morning. I'm not joking. And he would probably lay in a winter, he'd probably lay maybe 150 meters by himself. He's absolute passion of his. So he's a patron of our society, just here having a chat and admiring my son's work at a competition. So those materials that we bring in, the states and the top bindings, we buy those from a coppice woodland. Across the country, there are these wonderful ancient coppice woodlands. And these areas, you can see the cut stumps in front. These are cut on a 7-year rotation to produce these incredibly straight binders, as we call them. They produce lots of things like bean sticks, pea sticks, all sorts of things for thatching the straw roofs of houses. So we're supporting the secondary industry of rural craft. After you've laid your hedge, it is the time when you can trim it really, really tightly to encourage it to fill up. And if it's a short section, I often use these long-handled hedge trimmers. And by that way, I can start to train the hedge into this kind of like a letter A, the letter of the actual, the letter A. It's a good way to make a hedge grow becoming narrower at the top and thicker at the base. So cutting the hedge after you've hedge laid is very important. So I've talked mostly about hedges out in the countryside. Very often I am asked to do it in gardens, especially on that kind of border between the formal garden and the countryside, the estate out the back. This was an example of a lovely big house, beautifully designed behind here. But this kind of semi-formal, the laid hedge, this inter boundary between the two areas works, I think, really, really well. Again, here, this was a house. They had a hedge with it. Didn't know what to do with it. It was actually laurel that had got really, really tall, and I laid it over, and it will be absolutely fine. So I think I've gone quicker than I thought, which is really good. So it's just a last 2 or 3 slides here is just a kind of a plea, a wish really for the future, that we don't continue to trim our rural hedges so hard with machines that we almost are murdering them and they end up like ghost hedges. We have to rejuvenate our hedges in the UK on a long cycle of 30 or 40 years, so that they are healthy and they provide this unbelievable biodiversity reservoir throughout the countryside. We really seriously have to look after them so that our countryside, which is a mosaic of tall, old, young, new, of healthy hedgerows, vibrant corridors through our countryside, we really must look after our hedges, and I hope we do this into the future. Thank you very much for listening.